if you're a fan of the Unregistered podcast, you should go right now to patreon.com/unregistered, because right there is where most of the content in the unregistered world is being created. You'll get access to the bonus episodes of Unregistered, which recently featured Curtis Yarvin. You'll also have access to the Unregistered Live weekly Zoom meetings on Thursday nights with me. And then at the Unregistered Academy level, you can have access to all of our courses that we're teaching, including recently our book club course on James Burnham's Managerial Revolution featuring Curtis Yarvin. We also had the history of NATO with Scott Ritter and many more. So again, go to patreon.com/unregistered and I'll see you in class. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Recently, members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization held a special summit in Madrid, Spain. Only one reporter who attended that summit noted that what NATO was now calling for was tantamount to a declaration of World War III. This is my interview with that reporter, Michael Tracey. I am joined from Jersey City, New Jersey by my favorite journalist, Michael Tracey. He's back. And Michael Tracey here just sent a missile right into the little portal in the Death Star. And I'm hoping that it'll reach the center of the Death Star and blow the whole thing up, but maybe not. It could just be deflected by the defenses of the Death Star. You were at the annual NATO summit in Madrid, Spain recently, and you reported on it on your Substack. And the things you reported, as far as I know, and I've been following this pretty closely, no one else has reported at all. No one. Yeah. And the thing is, what you reported on, sir, is what you call the contours of what could very well be the next world war that were formalized at this NATO summit. And having read your reporting and having looked into what was done at this NATO summit, I think you're right. NATO took a dramatic, historic move and made a lot of other statements, and no one cares. No one is talking about it in the media, in the West at least, except you, and except, and a few of your friends in journalism who care about this stuff, like Max Blumenthal and Glenn Greenwald. They would relay what you've said, but no one in the regular, real, normal media cares at all. So let's talk about, first, I guess, what did happen at the NATO summit that was especially momentous, historic?
Well, first of all, if I really am your favorite journalist, that must mean the collective reputation of journalists has truly collapsed to an unprecedented low. So I'm not sure how much assurance I should take from that designation. But anyway, well, yeah. Well, I mean, what you're referring to was reported on somewhat in just the generic press accounts that, if you looked, you could find on the summit, which is that for the first time, NATO essentially formally denounced China as one of its chief adversaries. Now, if you actually pressed, for example, the Secretary General on that designation, Jens Stoltenberg, I mean, who cares what his name is really, because he's just a functionary, but he would deny that NATO actually is targeting China as an adversary. But that's the clear, almost unavoidable inference that one would have to make from the text of this strategic decree that they issued. So every NATO summit, there's one of these formal documents issued that is supposed to reflect the collective security priorities of the entire alliance, which is now 30 states. And every 10 years or so, they issue one of these more overarching strategic decrees that goes beyond just the general communique that they might issue a typical NATO summit. So in 2022, this year in Madrid, was the first time since 2010 that they issued one of these overarching strategic decrees that kind of set the guidelines in place for what their priorities will be for the next decade or more.
Wow.
And clearly, what was set out in this decree was, as I wrote in that one of those pieces, what could very well be the contours of the next global war, World War III. I mean, that sounds melodramatic potentially to people who aren't following along on the details, but I mean, at a certain point, it's hard to deny the logical implications of what it is that they're declaring are their strategic priorities. So China had never even been mentioned before in any of these documents that have been published by NATO over the course of its, 70, 80 years in history. And that happened only this year for the first time. Now, there had been rumblings that NATO was refocusing more and more on the Indo-Pacific prior to this past summit, but this year, in June, it was formalized in the form of the official text that can now be referenced forevermore in this strategic decree. And the text castigates China's conduct as malicious, calls it confrontational, and on top of that, the decree lauded that for the first time, the summit was bringing in the heads of state or government from 4 new Indo-Pacific countries. So Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And it was supposed to be a big deal that they were inviting the heads of state or heads of government to the summit for the first time. There have been lower level interchanges with those countries before, but this kind of crystallized their involvement as key partners of the alliance. And so basically it was an announcement that NATO was now going to play a much more assertive role in an entirely new region of the world, far beyond its original remit, almost like the opposite of what its original remit was geographically. Because NATO, as you probably know, was founded as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, dealing with the North Atlantic, like it was the United States and Britain and France and whatever, you throw in Canada. Now, for some reason, they're incredibly fixated on what they call the Indo-Pacific, which is just kind of a bizarrely vague term in its own right. But clearly, it's around China, and the impetus for this renewed focus on China, clearly by the text of the decree, is that they object in the strongest terms that China has forged this new, seemingly deepening alliance with Russia. And of course, that's supposed to spark more and more alarm given the war in Ukraine. So they're basically setting up what a forthcoming world war would look like, one that you could kind of maybe conjure up in your head as an imaginary scenario in the past, but now they're formalizing it and making it more vivid and real. And in the popular media coverage of the summit, it was noted that they had brought their attention to China for the first time, at least, in the form of this decree. But the logical implication of that was never really sussed out, in that, they're doing this to basically formulate the contours of what the next world war could be. And there could be so many potential sparks to that, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's the Ukraine situation, spiraling into another escalatory phase. There were even, people I saw online, thankfully nothing seems to have come of this, but when Shinzo Abe, the former former prime minister of Japan was randomly and shockingly assassinated a week ago. I mean, you could see the murmurings that there are factions around the world, including in the US, who are, want to immediately leap to this idea that China could have been responsible, and therefore that ought to trigger some kind of military action. So who knows what the actual spark of this could be? It could be some sort of Franz Ferdinand moment that we can't really anticipate. But the kind of structures of American/Western military and economic hegemony are increasingly arrayed so as to make it so that one of these sparks could easily light the fire, right? So the problem, I guess, with most of the media is you have to have a degree of foresight to be able to apprehend this. Not even that it's really so deeply hidden or anything, but you have to be able to think about things beyond just this instant gratification news cycle outlook. And most journalists are not really inclined to do that. So even I if you read one of my pieces, I have the exact wording, but to paraphrase, what was said in this decree was that NATO is increasingly marshaling its technological, military, and other capabilities in order to engage in real-time war fighting against nuclear peer competitors. That was the phrasing in this decree. And of course, they're talking about China and Russia probably acting jointly. And so that's a statement on the part of NATO that they're making preparations to wage a nuclear war. And it's just, nobody seems to, I mean, you would think that would be a slightly bigger story than it was.
That's right. Yeah. And not just reported on Substack.
Yeah, especially given that there's already a conflict raging right now where the specter of nuclear war has already been raised, meaning in Ukraine. So there's a hot war happening that could lead to this eventuality potentially. It's not just some totally intangible, far away possibility that we're only have access to in scheming out these war game scenarios. There's actually a hot war happening that could. In some reasonable degree of likelihood lead to this outcome.
So NATO has been, I think this is fair to say, officially hostile to Russia, right? And now, am I right? It's officially, formally hostile toward China.
I think that's roughly right. Yeah.
Now, let me go further. Let me ask this. Would you say that they are now officially belligerent toward China?
Well, I think so. NATO was essentially founded in the first place to be, quote, hostile to Russia, right? Or to be a bulwark against the Soviet Union. So that's nothing new or surprising. But it is new and surprising, at least in terms of the traditional attitudes and functions and outlook of NATO, that they would have expanded to China, because over and over again, the NATO operatives and the heads of state, everybody who's speaking on behalf of the utility of NATO will say to the ad nauseum that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, right? They'll say that all the criticisms against NATO that are leveled by Russia and China and whoever else, or domestic critics, they're totally without merit, because what those critics don't understand is that NATO is always and everywhere a defensive alliance.
Right.
And yet at the same time, at this past summit, they were celebrating the fact that they were overtly and explicitly expanding their mandate dramatically beyond its original confines, and talking about how NATO needs to basically bolster allied defenses in the Pacific to counter China. So at the very least, NATO in that case would have to be an expansionist alliance, because it's expanding manifestly beyond its original remit. But it seems like nobody there even gets that potential discrepancy. So, I asked a couple of people about it, but meaning officials that I happened to randomly get access to at this bizarre summit. But hardly any media coverage that I saw touched on it, and I didn't hear it much discussed at all at this summit by journalists or attendees or anyone. In part because people who go to a summit like this are very professionally and ideologically invested in the virtue of NATO, so it wouldn't even enter their stream of consciousness to have a critical thought such as that.
Right.
Also, they're just very lazy, I found, or boring, stale, and don't think in robust enough terms to have a thought like that enter into their brains.
Yeah.
Is NATO not belligerent against China? Well, I think if you look at the phraseology it used in that decree, calling China's conduct malicious, saying it was subverting the rules-based international order, denouncing it for aligning with Russia, which of course that NATO designated threat number 1 or something to that effect. That seems like fairly threatening. You might even say belligerent type rhetoric, and clearly China perceived it as belligerent,
right,
in its response.
Right.
And that's really, I mean, in sort of international relations, if you want to put it that way, a realist perspective, all that matters is that China perceived it that way.
Yeah. So yes, as you said, the argument made by pro-NATO people, and this is people in foreign policy think tanks, this is a lot of academics. If you go to international relations departments in pretty much any major university, you're going to find many, many people there who are arguing on behalf of NATO, in part because they have contracts with the State Department at a lot of those departments. So the pro-NATO people have said since the beginning, and especially recently, since NATO's come under more criticism under Trump, they say repeatedly that it is a defensive alliance. And their evidence for that is that NATO has always said it was a defensive alliance. That has been the stated policy. That's what NATO has said, sir. So they have said they're a defensive tautology. Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Yes. Yeah. And then I guess they would also say that it is expanded to these new states, the now 30 member states, which I think is double or triple the original number, because these states asked for it. And which is true. I mean, the governments in those nation states did want to be a part of NATO. And they felt the governments of those nation states, I think, legitimately felt under threatened by Russia. Okay, so that's why NATO is a defensive alliance, according to them. Before they expanded to the Pacific Ocean, before that argument always seemed strange to me, because as I understand it, and I don't even know the exact numbers of the weapons and stuff arrayed there, but NATO in Europe has missiles, nuclear missiles pointed at Russia. It has how many tanks on the ground in Europe? It has how many fighter jets and bomber jets at air bases all over Europe that it controls, that can bomb any part of Russia at any time or anywhere on the rest of the world. Not to mention the navies all around in the North Atlantic and the Atlantic and even the Mediterranean. How is that defensive? Then you have the fact that the wars that NATO has actually directly engaged in are where? Okay, yes, Yugoslavia, but other than Yugoslavia, it was what? Afghanistan and Libya. Last time we checked, those countries were not in the North Atlantic area, but now
it even played a supplementary role in Iraq.
But now with this declaration that they are hostile toward China and are certainly and planning on doing something against China for the first time, China is not on the North Atlantic. It's not even close to it, guys. How on earth can they sustain this argument that it is not expansionist, gotta say imperialistic, and aggressive? I don't get it. And it's a very scary thing.
Well, the word that I was floating was expansionist, because it's the least, acerbic of the three that you mentioned.
Right.
So you can make a case, I guess, that expansionism could be benign, right? Or that it wouldn't be inherently aggressive or something to that effect, right? I wanted to go with the lowest common denominator type word just to describe in basic terms what NATO was doing and see if anybody could bring themselves to agree that, yeah, I mean, this expansionism that we're plainly embarking upon now might genuinely be in tension with this cliche that we repeat over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
that NATO is purely defensive.
Mm-hmm.
But even just using the word expansionist, so forget imperialist, forget belligerent, whatever, just expansionist, because it is expanding. I mean, they're saying that we're expanding into the Indo-Pacific, okay? But you can't even like get people to wrap their minds around that, because NATO is like, in addition to the bureaucratic structure and the military structure, it has this whole kind of like intellectual, quasi-intellectual superstructure undergirding it that's just based on a foundation of cliches and slogans, and hardly anybody can be compelled to probe underneath those foundations. So you can't even get people to think beyond these handful of cliches and pablum that they've been force fed. It's very strange.
I want to get into your critique of the journalists who were there and the journalists who cover these issues, which is just devastating critique and really makes me despair for journalism, although I already have. But I want to talk about global politics for a second. I know this is not exactly your bailiwick, but this new hostility toward China, both in NATO and to some extent in the U.S., in Biden's cabinet, and Trump's cabinet too, for that matter, is confusing to me. I understand why the Trump people and MAGA are hostile to China, although it's not clear they want war, but they certainly want some action taken against China. But the hostility of the Democrats and liberals and neoconservatives and neoliberals, the people who've made foreign policy in this country for a century or so, why they are now hostile to China is confusing to me, because last I checked, it looked very likely. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what you think on this, what your position is on this issue. It looks very likely that they were at least collaborating with China to create bioweapons. Now, why would the United States be participating in bioweapons development in China at the same time wanting to go to war with them? Not to mention all of the trade arrangements with China, not to mention all of the exchange, you could say, of Chinese businesses and intellectuals who come here and live here and flood into our universities. And we have universities across the country. How many of them have deals with the Chinese Communist Party to bring their students here? I've taught many Chinese students in my classes at colleges. We have institutes that are funded, think tanks that are funded in part by the Chinese government. It goes on and on. So there's a very, very tight collaboration between what would be called, I guess, the liberal globalists, mostly the Democratic Party people, and the Chinese Communist Party. So what the hell, man? Are they collaborating with China? Are they seeking to co-manage the world with China? That's what it was looking like to me. If they're having, and then war games, China had its war games in Canada a couple of years ago. I mean, there's a lot of tight collaboration. Is that what's going on? Or is it something else? Did they change their mind on China and now want to go to war with China?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a giant naval exercise that the U.S. leads in the Pacific,
that
China had previously been invited to participate in. And beginning, I think, in 2018, sometime under the Trump administration, and continuing up until the latest exercise that I believe is going to be this summer, China has been disinvited. So in the not distant past, China was enough in the good graces that it was able to conduct joint military exercises with the U.S., and that's now changed. And it seems like there's a very different trajectory in the relationship. And I think a lot of it probably has to do with Russia, frankly.
Yes.
In terms of,
that's what it is,
accelerating, especially the antipathy amongst the Democratic wing of the establishment against China. Because I think they probably would have been more or less, even begrudgingly tolerant of China, if not for it seeming to have been in bed with Russia and to have allegedly enabled or facilitated somehow this Ukraine war, beginning in February, when Xi famously invited Putin to the Winter Olympics ceremony and said that our friendship has no limits, and that was said.
Yep.
And there was a long document put out, a joint document between China and Russia, where China actually echoed Russia's grievances regarding NATO expansion.
Right.
And that's not a subject that really, as far as I know, or as far as most people who are conversant on the subject know, I think, not really a subject that they had waded into very much in the past. And so for some reason, recently it became, you know, a live issue.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting because one thing that has to be acknowledged and seldom acknowledged, because a lot of people in the American political system are very invested in heightening phony partisan distinctions. So they would probably be flabbergasted and angry if confronted with the evidence that actually the Trump administration and the Biden administration have virtually zero appreciable difference on the subject of China. I mean, there's total continuity. If anything, Biden has actually gone further than Trump. For example, in going to Japan in May and declaring that the US will essentially start a war against China in defense of Taiwan. Biden said that at a press conference, as you probably recall.
Yeah.
And so, you know, on the one hand, you'll have conservatives who will say to themselves, oh, I thought, you know, China, they had a whole thing in 2020 during the election that Joe Biden was compromised by China through his son or something, which, you know, there did seem to be some very questionable business dealings going on. But as usual, it got exaggerated into this whole partisan presumption that Biden was going to just be inherently soft on China, which didn't really seem to make any sense if you know anything about Joe Biden's foreign policy predilections going back decades. And then on the other hand, you know, I doubt many liberals would be too keen on acknowledging that either, because they don't want to think of Biden as just as or even more reckless on the international stage as Trump, and heightening tensions in this potentially cataclysmic direction with this rising superpower that's on the verge of supplanting the US in terms of economic and even maybe eventually military prowess.
Yeah.
But that's what he's doing.
Yeah.
And so, you know, but you know, you have to you really have to have the scales drop from the eyes of people in terms of their partisan affiliations in order to even begin to have a sensible and rational discussion about what that means. But it seems to mean, for one thing, that there is this thoroughly bipartisan, thoroughly establishmentarian drift toward somehow what seems to be, in the minds of many, this inevitable confrontation with China.
Yeah.
And that, so like it's just this law of nature or something that the US will eventually be at war with China, which seems insane. Like what are you actually saying here, that we're going to have World War III with China and Russia? I mean, that is like a civilization ending prospect potentially, but more and more you do see it being discussed as though it's just this unalterable truth of the universe.
Right.
And I guess I don't have a great explanation for why that is. I guess COVID maybe had some impact on it, where, you know, China became the bugaboo. But at the same time, you know, liberals, you know, when Trump was calling it the China virus, launched into this whole frenzy about how we can't scapegoat Asians, and it was seen as causing hate crimes and things like this. So they were really invested in pushing back against that, whatever its merits might have been. But they seem to be totally apathetic about the idea of actually going to war with China.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the thumbnail history. You know, so Nixon and Kissinger famously normalized relations with China in the early 70s. By the late 70s, early 80s, the Chinese government has an official agency within the government whose sole purpose is to establish trade relations with American corporations. So in the 80s and 90s, that relationship just deepens and deepens and deepens, and we're getting more and more and more and more products from China. Becomes our biggest trading partner. So we're very friendly to China in possibly the most important way economically. And yes, there was collaboration even between the militaries, as we've been saying, of the two countries, naval exercises in the Pacific, army exercises in Canada, all sorts of trade relations. And then also this collaboration between the NIH and the Wuhan lab, et cetera, which is just a piece of the collaboration. But then in the 90s, as we all know, Bill and Hillary decided that Vladimir Putin had to go. He was the problem in the world. And that became their focus, their obsession, you might say. And they sort of let China do China, let China be itself, and flood Walmart with its cheap products. But then this year, in March, I think it was, after the war in Ukraine had started and the sanctions had begun against Russia, China agreed to buy lots and lots and lots of Russian oil and pay for it, I believe, in rubles too. That, I believe, is when the rhetoric changed in the foreign policy establishment about China, and China became a real problem. I think what's happening is China's being warned, at least I hope so. I think they're being warned to end this relationship with Russia, to stop being a trading. I mean, because Alexander Dugin was on my show, and he's the guy who came up with the whole theory and the strategy of the Eurasian alliance. I mean, and that was very significant.
Interesting guest.
Yeah, it was amazing. But he's the one who came up with that idea that Russia and China should ally among themselves and form a power block in the middle of the world that would be undefeatable. And I think that what's happening is China is now being told, you know, we're going to let you slaughter the Uyghurs. We're going to let you crush freedom of speech. We're going to, you know, let you have political prisoners, but you can't help our guy Putin over there. You cannot help Russia. I hope and I think that's what's happening. I think if China does end its relationship with Russia, or at least weaken it, I do think the rhetoric will change back to one of sort of tolerance. The rhetoric about China has always been tolerance, right? It's never been denunciatory. It's never been moralistic. When they have plenty of opportunities to say nasty things about the CCP, they don't. But they also sort of don't condone China exactly, while all the while trillions of dollars are flowing back and forth between the two countries, right? So I think it is the Chinese-Russian alliance that has caused the foreign policy establishment in this country to change at least its rhetoric toward a more belligerent tone. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's
decent theory.
Largely, I think that it's a largely accurate theory.
Okay.
I think some of the history of the Russia element might not be exactly right though, because
okay.
I don't think it was Bill and Hillary Clinton who decided in the 90s one day that Putin had to go. I think Putin was actually embraced by the Western security establishment for a long time. They thought that he was going to be this, you know, Western-looking reformer, and he was feted, you know, by the Queen in London, and he was praised by Western leaders. He was, you know, he was the first world leader that George W. Bush spoke to on 9/11. And you know, they pledged to be partners in the war on terror and all this. So there was a honeymoon type period with Putin in the early 2000s that seemed to really begin disintegrating around the Iraq War, because the Iraq War is still an event that Putin cites as showing the hypocrisy of the West in their claimed fidelity to the rules-based international order. In the speech that Putin gave when he launched the invasion on February 24th of this year, he went through the litany of foreign policy actions undertaken by the U.S., which he called the Empire of Lies, that give the lie to this whole pretension that the U.S. is this determined upholder of international norms and mores and all this, with Iraq being a flagship example. And you know, there were to the extent that Putin had, you know, enemies in the early 2000s, it was people like, you know, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK taking a fringe position in opposing Putin for being excessively embraced by, you know, Tony Blair or something. Whereas, you know, that obviously that's shifted very much now, where it's this mainstream, totally inarguable position amongst every faction of the ideological spectrum. So, but I do think, you know, that nuance, that, you know, qualifier aside, I do think it is the case that this enmeshment of Russia and China has vastly accelerated the antipathy toward China in particular that might have otherwise just existed in this, gray zone of vague tolerance, not necessarily endorsing, but not condemning either. I think that might have been enabled to persist, and the really fuming, burning antipathy toward China would have been more relegated to, again, sort of a fringe position. Like Steve Bannon is always ranting about how there needs to be regime change in China. Like he's actually saying that the Chinese Communist Party not just has to be opposed, but overthrown. I mean, he said it overtly long before the Ukraine war. So I think they would have allowed that sentiment to just kind of exist in that smaller-ish segment of the American spectrum of political opinion. But with the Russia connection, it's been allowed to spread much more widely, to the point that the US was clearly the chief instigator in formalizing this targeting of China within the NATO summit in this formal decree. So it percolated from, the rhetoric in the summit decree is not as extreme as what Steve Bannon would say, but kind of the basic premise is now embraced and framed in this kind of rules-based international order idiom, and then crystallized in that summit decree. And it's gone well beyond where it might have been relegated to had there not been this collaboration, seemingly or allegedly, between Putin, geopolitical enemy number one, and Xi, who is also a geopolitical adversary or something, but now has been elevated also to full-fledged enemy status.
Yes, when the MAGA Republicans enter Congress in huge numbers in the fall and start to do business in January, they're going to do a lot of great things, I think, in terms of oversight committees and investigations of things like Russiagate and the origins of COVID and January 6th, things that I think are going to be fantastic. But they will also now have some more power over, holy God, over U.S. foreign policy. And they are famously, as you just said, very hostile toward China. One could argue that hostility to China is the primary goal of that movement, that hostility to China is really what animated Trump in the beginning, more than even more than Mexico and immigration. So I am very concerned. I said, we kind of agree that the collaboration between the alliance between Russia and China is what's caused this hostility toward China in the establishment. I am just hoping that hostility will be transitory, that once China learns its lesson that they can't be friends with Russia, then we will soften our relations with China once again. However, here's the thing. Did you see what's that?
I was just gonna say that there's no sign of that whatsoever, meaning a softening rather than a hardening
so far. And I'm about to give you even more evidence to support what you just said. Did you see or listen to the Mike Pompeo speech at the Hudson Institute about 2 weeks ago?
I think I saw a clip of it or saw a brief summary of it. I should have listened to the full thing, but no, okay. It didn't tell me.
Okay, everyone needs to go, as soon as they finish this interview, they need to go listen to that or watch that speech by Mike Pompeo at the Hudson Institute. It was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think it was about an hour-long speech. You can also read a transcript of it. It is stunning, and it is this brazen declaration of American imperial prerogatives. I mean, this is like back in the good old days of Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt talking about it is our mission to civilize the world, to uplift, the poor benighted victims of the oppressors. No, he identifies Russia and China as the enemies who need to be removed. And it's a shocking speech. Now, Pompeo's running for president, looks like. I think that's right. And so it was a campaign speech, essentially. Now, he comes from the Trump White House. Everyone knows that, but he was not entirely comfortable with Trump, nor was Trump comfortable with him. The MAGA folks don't like him.
Wait, Pompeo was pretty comfortable with Trump. I mean, the reason why Pompeo stayed on as Secretary of State and was even elevated to Secretary of State in the first place in the Trump administration, because he displayed an unusual ability to like accommodate Trump, to placate Trump, and to consolidate his own stature within the administration, unlike many others. So Pompeo never actually fell out with Trump.
No, but he's a straight up globalist. So I mean, not Trump personally, I don't know exactly what he thought of Pompeo, but I know MAGA do not like him. Bannon, Steve Bannon and company do not like that guy because he's an unabashed globalist. And this speech is one of the most striking examples of globalist thinking I've seen in a long time.
But hold on a second,
Sure.
because
Sure.
the in 2018, the Pentagon put out one of its, I think, quadrennial. I mean, there's no exact number of years that by which there's no exact interval in which one of these documents has to be published, but it was like this national security document that outlined, it's sort of like the equivalent of the NATO summit for the Pentagon, in terms of the decree that's issued that outlines the broad strategic vision. And this in 2018 under Trump, this national security strategy decree was also being championed because it formalized the shifts away from focusing on terrorism as the main kind of orientation of the Defense Department. And instead was saying, now we're in this return of a great power competition with Russia and China, but with China as kind of the bigger leg in that arrangement. So that was done under the Trump administration. It seems like they're all about that because, for one thing, it justifies further defense expenditure, modernization, overhauling the nuclear arsenal, all kinds of other. That was why they needed to start the Space Force, allegedly, a new branch of the military. So I mean, this whole Pompeo's a globalist, but Trump isn't, and therefore MAGA doesn't like him. I mean, I just don't buy these low IQ distinctions anymore that get grafted onto this whole confluence of people who claim to have these really well-defined ideological distinctions, but really don't when it comes down to it. Because that's his administration is where this globalist construct emerged from, talking about the great power competition. So I think you'd be hard pressed to explain where it is that Trump and Pompeo actually diverge on the substance.
Well, okay, so there's Trump, as I said, there's Trump himself, and then there's the MAGA movement, right? So if you look at,
what does that mean anymore? It's just
wait. So look at the candidates for Congress that he's endorsed, right? Those are MAGA people. You look every single one.
Dr. Oz.
I think so, but more importantly, Blake Masters, JD Vance in Ohio, Joe Kent.
Those are two guys.
Joe Kent.
What's Herschel Walker's foreign policy?
Well, Herschel Walker doesn't have two ideas to put together.
I don't think because he liked JD Vance because he wrote a best-selling book, and he liked Blake Masters because Peter Thiel was one of his big financiers. That necessarily means that there's this very distinct and decipherable MAGA tendency that reflects what Trump genuinely believes. But Dr. Oz and Herschel Walker, for some reason, don't. It's just a mishmash.
Well, I don't know what Dr. Oz's foreign policy positions
exactly
are. Oh well, but I'm saying the people who are Trump candidates are the most anti-imperialist, anti-NATO, anti-regime change, anti-nation building people in our country. The left, the anti-war left, should be ashamed of itself because they are nowhere near as truly anti-war as these candidates for Senate who are running under Trump's name.
What's the position of? You tell me if you know. What's the position of Blake Masters? Do Blake Masters and JD Vance agree with a Steve Bannon type on China? And if so, how does that relate to your statement that they're the most anti-war, anti-imperialist people in the country?
So Bannon has consistently, all of them, all the people I'm talking about, including Bannon, have consistently stated that they are not in favor of any military action against China.
Bannon has endorsed regime change against China. How do you achieve that if not through?
He makes it very clear. He makes it very clear. He might be lying, but he makes it very clear. They all do that he's calling for the Chinese people to
So they
overthrow
want
regime.
okay, sure.
Well,
so they want regime change in China. They just want to do it in a gentle, friendly way.
no, in a real way, in an organic, internal way. I mean, like revolutions often are. I mean, why do you not believe them?
I just don't, because I look at what they say as regards Taiwan, for instance, and they're totally in favor. And again, I don't have the specifics of the position of a Blake Masters or a J.D. Vance in Taiwan, but people who are generally put in that category of the pure-hearted MAGA anti-war types. If you look at what they say about Taiwan, for example, they want to ramp up the U.S. military engagement in Taiwan such that the U.S. is basically on the hook militarily if there is some kind of outbreak of hostilities in Taiwan. And so they agree with Biden. They should have been cheering Joe Biden when he went to that press conference in Japan and said that the U.S. will come to the defense militarily of Taiwan in the event of some kind of war with China, because that's the logical next step of what it is they're calling for, even if it might be a bit uncouth to come out if you're Steve Bannon and say, oh yeah, we want regime change in China, we're going to relentlessly demonize the Chinese Communist Party and make sure we always say the word communist very forcefully to send a shiver down the spines of our listeners, who are mostly conservatives, including many older conservatives who have this ancestral hatred of communism from the Cold War period. And we also want to, escalate our furnishment of armaments to Taiwan, basically make it an adjunct of the U.S. hegemonic project. And
I'm not sure. Have they said that they want to arm Taiwan?
Well, yeah, of course
they have.
Yeah, I mean, look,
the way that we're arming Ukraine. Have have MAGA people said that the United States should furnish arms to Taiwan? I've not seen
signed off on the furnishment of arms to Taiwan. I mean that's been happening progressively for years.
Again, the MAGA movement is different than Trump on this.
Is Trump part of the MAGA movement? I mean, that's why I don't. That's why it's like it's like an incoherent blur at this point. I mean, so Trump is not part of the MAGA movement. Okay, then what's the MAGA movement?
No, he's part of it, but he diverges in certain ways that they're upset about, right? And okay, so
I've never heard anyone in the MAGA movement object. Anyone of stature within the MAGA movement object to the idea of furnishing armaments to Taiwan to fortify their defenses against the Chinese threat.
Okay.
And if there have been examples of that, I'd be happy to review them. But
so here's what I would do if I had Blake Masters, J.D. Vance, or Donald Trump on my show. I would ask them this very question. I mean, no, these are very good questions. So here's the official position, I think, of MAGA and Trump on China, that the United States Navy needs to reestablish absolute dominance of the entire Pacific and especially the South China Sea. Okay, so that's clear. They want U.S. Navy warships all over the place around China for sure. Basically containment, I guess. What do you got here?
I mean, this is just the first thing that popped up, just so you can see. October 22nd, 2020, U.S. approves $1.8 billion weapons sale to Taiwan in a move that is likely to increase tensions with China. The Pentagon said the deal comprised 3 weapon systems, including rocket launchers, sensors, and artillery.
Okay.
I mean, that's just one. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I know Trump signed off on a lot of stuff that, again, I think diverges at least from MAGA rhetoric. Okay, I don't know what's really going on, but I can tell you that the rhetoric is that we shouldn't be giving arms to any foreign country. They're very consistent about that. Now, here's what I would ask them. Okay, I would say, guys, listen, you're for like flooding the Pacific and the South China Sea with U.S. warships, right? Do you not think that will lead to a direct hot war with China? I mean, I think they might be either disingenuous or naive about this, but that is their position. And anyway, I'm not here actually to argue that point. I'm arguing kind of more your point about Pompeo. Pompeo scares the shit out of me because Pompeo is right in between the two parties. He's right in between MAGA, Trump, and the Democrats. This guy is like trying to thread that needle, and he might be doing it. And he is absolutely calling for real war with both Russia and China. And so I am terrified that he is now representing the position of the foreign policy establishment of both the left and the right. And I would ask anybody in the MAGA movement, do you endorse what Mike Pompeo said at the Hudson Institute, in that Russia and China constitute existential threats to the West and therefore must be taken down? Are you in favor of that? And is your blue water navy that controls the entire Pacific right up to the coast of China, is that not going to start a hot war with China? That's what I would ask them. So,
do you consider Josh Hawley a member of the MAGA movement?
Mostly, yeah.
Okay. Here's Josh Hawley, official Senate website.
Cool. All right.
April 2022.
Look up Blake.
Today, Josh Hawley introduced the Taiwan Weapons Export Act, which would fast track the delivery of critical weapons to Taiwan by expediting congressional approval and eliminating administrative roadblocks. The threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is growing. It needs naval mines, anti-tank missiles, man-portable defense systems, and other asymmetric defense capabilities. Are you telling me that Blake Masters and J.D. Vance would declare to Josh Hawley that they oppose this? I don't know. Taiwan's Weapons Export Act? They wouldn't.
Wait a minute. I would
believe that it's plausible that they would oppose that.
What I would say to them, if I don't know, I look that up. Look up a Blake Masters, J.D. Vance, and Joe Kent from Washington believe in this stuff. What their position is on this, I would say to them, if you do favor arming Taiwan, that contradicts your political philosophy of isolationism. That the United States
doesn't. Maybe they're not actually isolationists. Maybe isolationism is a misnomer.
That's your thing. I know that's what you believe about them.
Maybe they ought to be isolationists. That would be preferable, because there are no actual isolationists. They're just people who get attacked as isolationists despite not being isolationists. But maybe isolationists should be, given a shot.
Okay. No, I agree. I mean, I want them to be isolationists, of course, and I'm hoping that they are. But no, I'm more on your side now. I'm getting more and more pessimistic. I'm basically kind of agreeing with you.
That's my whole purpose in life, to engender pessimism.
You do a good job of it, unfortunately, simply by reporting on what governments are doing. Yeah. So we'll see. Everyone go listen.
And by the way, also Hawley, I mean, she sort of changed his tune a little bit, I guess, maybe after some public pressure, but earlier on in the Ukraine war, Hawley joined with virtually the entire rest of the Republican caucus to be more hawkish than Biden was willing to be on arming Ukraine. Yeah. So he signed on to this letter that Lindsey Graham organized to demand that fighter jets be sent into Ukraine. Okay. When Biden was seeming to be reluctant to do so. So I mean, I don't believe the sincerity of these people.
No.
They don't demonstrate any consistency in their preferences around the supposed MAGA anti-interventionist worldview.
Josh Hawley is not.
It always falls down in the face of fact.
Josh Hawley is not pure MAGA. He doesn't identify as that. He doesn't identify as a.
Who's pure MAGA?
Guys, I've been talking about.
I thought the MAGA people love the prospect of J.D. Vance and Blake Masters joining the Senate because they would form a bloc with Josh Hawley and represent true MAGA. No,
if you listen to Bannon and all these people, I'm okay. Listen, on Ukraine, right? You certainly know this, that MAGA is uniformly, absolutely opposed to arming Ukraine and always has been.
No, they're not.
100%. Eric Greitens in Missouri, another Trump, definitely a Trump MAGA candidate for Senate.
Which president started arming Ukraine? Which president for the first time began sending lethal weapons to Ukraine?
Trump did. This is true.
This
is true.
So it was Donald Trump, but not the MAGA movement. And so let's go now into multiple different dimensions of semantics as to what MAGA constitutes.
Wait a minute.
Was there a groundswell of opposition when Trump stopped? When Trump started sending lethal weapons to Ukraine, which Putin cites as one of the chief justifications for the war? I don't recall that.
So wait, are you arguing that they
speculate anymore about what MAGA quote unquote does when it's in power? It had 4 years.
So are you really? I mean, you're
unified Republican control of the Congress and the White House.
So you're saying that the MAGA movement, led by Steve Bannon, by the way, not Donald Trump, is actually for arming Ukraine?
Well, no, I think they're circumstantially probably largely against it now because it kind of settled into this partisan thing where they can criticize Joe Biden for it. If Trump were in office, they wouldn't be against arming Ukraine. And Trump probably would be arming Ukraine. He still brags about arming Ukraine.
I mean, what we're arguing...
Trump MAGA or not? That's what I don't get. Because if you listen to Trump's words, even in the past couple months, he denounces Biden for not being aggressive enough in arming Ukraine, which he started doing, meaning Trump.
I hear you. I know that's all true. Listen, so what we're arguing about is actually of tremendous importance, which is what these people will do once they take power, right? Because there's a very good chance Trump will be back in the White House and he'll have a MAGA Congress, right? What will they do in foreign policy? Now, I'm saying we're having a very useful argument here. There is evidence to believe that they will go hawkish on China and Russia, that they will act like neocons once they're in power.
And that evidence is based on what was actually done during the Trump administration, which we have 4 years of evidence to.
Yeah, but he didn't. I mean, but he was certainly less interventionist than all the previous administrations, wasn't he? There was
Not on Ukraine.
No new war was started. Didn't start a new war.
He was more interventionist in Ukraine than Obama.
It's arguable. Anyway, there's evidence on your.
It's not arguable. I mean, Obama refused to send lethal arms to Ukraine. Trump did it because he acceded to the lobbying efforts of, guess who? That's right, John McCain, in conjunction with Lindsey Graham. They got Trump to do what Obama wouldn't do because Obama was a pansy, and and according to Trump, would only send blankets and pillows, whereas Trump really stuck it to Putin by sending Javelin missiles. That's true. That's true. That's
I know, Michael.
How is that not more interventionist than Obama?
You formerly, I believed, identified as a Bernie supporter, correct?
Well, now you're changing the subject. But
no, I'm not. I'm not. Wait.
I never identified as a quote Bernie supporter.
Okay, but many people.
I acknowledge that I voted for Bernie in the 2016 Democratic primary.
Okay, would you say that there's a Bernie movement?
There was. I'm not sure what form it takes. Yeah, I mean, roughly, yes.
That's identifiable, like has an identifiable set of ideas and ideologies, right?
I mean, as much as any movement of that sort can be definable.
And there are millions of people who are passionate about Bernie and his politics, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where are we going here?
How many
more or less interventionist than the MAGA people?
No.
More.
How many of them want to? How many of them want to continue the drone program in the Middle East, and how many of them want to support Israel to the fullest extent, which are Bernie's positions? Virtually none, I would wager. Does that mean they're not Bernie people? Does that mean they're not pro Bernie? Does that mean there's no reason to lump them together with Bernie?
I mean, I don't think it's correct that Bernie wants to support Israel to its fullest extent. I mean, he had been pressured, especially since between the 2016 campaign and the 2020 campaign, to, for example, call for greater conditions upon military aid, to condemn the settlements. I mean, Donald Trump, if you want to talk about interventionism, if Israel counts, which I know it gets carved out into this special little category that doesn't, have relevance for the rest of U.S. policy oftentimes. But Donald Trump went around bragging that he was the most hardcore pro-Israel president ever. And he was right.
I know. Yeah, I know. MAGA's pro-Israel. I know
but
that.
That's not MAGA, right?
No,
so
it is.
How many of these contradictions have to pile up before we recognize that there's some definitional issue here?
So, I mean, it sounds like you're arguing that there's simply no distinction among any of these people. So that Bernie people are the same as MAGA, and MAGA's the same as neocons, and neocons are the same as.
Not that there's no difference, but I think it should. Most of the people who voted for George W. Bush voted for Donald Trump. Okay, I remember going to a Donald Trump rally.
Yes.
In 2020. So this was 4 years into his presidency.
Yes.
Okay, in rural Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just be kind of people watching and listening to people, and I heard a nice lady talking to a group. Says, the first rally that I ever went to, and I was so supportive of George W. Bush in 2004, and she was, bringing caravans of people there and helping to volunteer and all this. And now she had the same amount of passion for Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to, make a cheap hypocrisy point or anything like that. I'm just saying that there's 95% overlap in the electorate between people who voted for Bush and voted for Trump. So a lot of the policies also just get a different gleam or sheen put on them. Not saying that there's total overlap between Bush and Trump. There isn't. I mean, there are some significant differences.
Okay.
But, especially in terms of Israel and Russia policy, even, I mean, there is a lot of continuity that it makes people feel better to deny, because then it kind of makes it seem more noble to support whatever their current faction is that has this new branding and sloganeering apparatus associated with it. But it really is oftentimes just a total continuity.
Okay, I think that people who voted for Trump are going to be much more skeptical about the next American war abroad than other people in this country. They're going to be the most skeptical. Do
you recall a lot of skepticism from that crowd when Trump assassinated Soleimani?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, hold on. Wait. I didn't say they're peaceniks. They love.
No, I'm not saying.
No.
But that was a war-like action, wasn't it?
I'm talking about imperialist wars, what the left calls imperialist wars. They are definitely hostile to that.
So it wasn't an imperialist action.
Let me define it.
To assassinate by drone bombing.
Let me define
an Iranian general in Iraq which led to Iraq, to the Parliament of Iraq, to demand the expulsion of U.S. military forces. Then Trump and Pompeo and everybody else refused to acquiesce to that. That wasn't an imperialist, if you want to put it that way. Actually,
I would call it, it's a form of imperialism that's very different than the imperialism that has been dominant, which has been direct control of foreign countries through various means, by invasions, occupations. But
I mean, there have been drone bombings in Pakistan. We haven't been trying to.
No, I know that. But wait, are you really suggesting that there is just no tendency among MAGA and Trump supporters I think there's an ostensible tendency that, when tested in practice, doesn't seem to mean much. Oh, well, that could be true. That's what I'm worried about. That's why I brought up the Pompeo speech, right? That is exactly what I'm worried. I'm worried that, yes, when push comes to shove and they're in the White House and they control the levers of American foreign policy.
In order to justify that Soleimani strike,
yeah,
the Trump administration, presumably Donald Trump, the guy who started the whole MAGA thing, signs off on this. Or if he doesn't, then he's more cognitively deficient than Biden seems to be, because his administration put out an official legal justification for the Soleimani strike that cited the 2002 authorization for use of force in Iraq as a legal justification for the strike on Soleimani. So, I mean, is that totally divorced from this idea of imperialism that supposedly now all these MAGA people are against? I mean, in aggregate, I know what the point you're making, and I understand it, and I largely agree with at least that ostensible tendency. Okay. And of course, it reflects ridiculously poorly on the quote left that they're being outdone by MAGA types in even bothering to begin to raise some kind of critical points or skeptical points about the current nature of the policy in Ukraine. I don't doubt that at all.
Okay.
I just think that a lot of this is driven more than people would like to admit by sheer partisanship and opportunism. And with a Democratic administration in power, that gives an opening to seize upon a partisan opportunity to say that, you know, the administration has no sound policy on Ukraine, and therefore, you know, 10 of us in the Senate will vote against the $40 billion.
Okay.
But it doesn't really mean much. It's kind of like a kabuki theater.
Let me ask you a related question, which is, do you believe that there is any significant difference in the foreign policy ideologies of John McCain and Donald Trump? And I think there's actually three tendencies here. There's between McCain and the Democratic Party form of globalism, on their ideology on foreign policy. The John McCain approach to foreign affairs compared to the great Democratic globalists of the last 100 years. Is there any difference between the two? I think there is, but I could be wrong. John Bolton, I would say also. John Bolton, to me, Bolton is a McCainian. He's not a Wilsonian. There's a Wilsonian tendency, which is, right, really clearly global American imperialism, you know, direct control of foreign countries, direct control of all the trade routes, all that stuff, Suez Canal, right? And exporting our culture and our democracy and the whole 9 yards. That's Wilsonian, right? McCain and Bolton don't really talk like that. Now, I could be wrong, but they seem they don't hate war. That's for sure. They don't hate war.
McCain, you know, peace be upon his soul, was very much into this whole rhetoric of the promulgation of American quote values in this Wilsonian fashion. Back during the 2000 Republican primaries, they organized neocon movement, like the Bill Kristol types when they were still Republicans.
Yeah.
They all initially supported McCain, and then they gravitated once Bush got the nomination to him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But McCain was the archetype of the neocon for a while.
Yeah.
Because he trafficked in this vernacular that would be more redolent of Wilsonian dissemination of American values and making the world safe for democracy and all this, on top of just the brute force of expansion of American hegemonic power through trade routes and all the rest.
I mean, he goes along with the neocon agenda for sure. Obviously he does. He loves killing bad guys, but I don't see him as an intellectual in that way. I don't see of him as having that whole set of ideas. It's a very complex, sophisticated system.
Right. Well, neither was Bush. I mean, Bush wasn't an intellectual either, but he was still.
No, he went along with him, right? I mean, I'm not sure Bush is really a neocon. I mean, he couldn't have written.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Right. I mean,
he was the vehicle for what neocons
exactly
wanted.
Exactly. Yeah. So but there's the neocon neoliberal globalist set of ideas, which again was originated at the early 20th century. Yeah, that's a very particular identifiable ideology. It's very coherent, it's very sophisticated, it requires professors to come up with it, right? It's a whole set of ideas. You got to be smart to know that this country needs that kind of government and that country needs this other kind of government, right? You have to be a Crystal or a Podhoretz, someone like that. I don't see those guys that way. They love punishing America's enemies. They can't get enough of that for sure.
Which
and they
guys?
might the McCainians and the Boltonites.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a different kind, and it really comes from, and here's, I guess, a historical point I want to make. It comes from the Reagan administration. So Reagan's foreign policy was not neoconservative. He was not a neocon. He was not into regime change, really. I mean, he just wanted to keep the commies out of Central America, and he was going to do anything he wanted. He didn't need to have a puppet state. He didn't need a direct control of those countries. He just wanted to kill the commies, which he did. It's a very different. It's a realist. It's realist foreign policy. It comes from Kissinger. It's Kissingerian. I think these guys are Kissingerians. Ultimately, they're not interested again in democracy being exported to the world and all these things, but they do want to kill America's enemies.
Yeah, I mean,
they want America to be powerful. They want America to be powerful, but they don't want America to be the world's policeman.
Right. I remember when Bolton was named National Security Advisor in 2018, a lot of people found it surprising because they thought that he was so incongruous with Trump's apparent foreign policy vision, that how could it be that this old Bush official would be imported to Trump's administration. And I pointed out that Bolton is not himself a tried and true neoconservative.
Right.
And a lot of people said, well, no, what are you talking about? He was all about the Iraq War. And it's true, he was.
Right.
But there are some subtle distinctions that you have to make between these different species of hawks that populate the foreign policy establishment.
There you go.
And sometimes the distinctions are so subtle that it really doesn't matter anymore.
Maybe.
I mean, it's just theoretical, because who cares if Bolton is technically a neoconservative ideologue if what he's supporting is the same policy ultimately.
Right. No, I hear you.
And I think a similar argument can be made for liberal interventionists trying to distinguish themselves from neoconservatives, because when the rubber hits the road, they're pretty much arguing for the same thing. So yeah, you can make these subtle theoretical distinctions, but it all kind of congeals into a blob after a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, all that matters is what they do when they have power. Right. And that's what we're trying to figure out here. And it's actually a very useful argument, I think, because we're trying to guess what they're going to do once they have power. And that, that should determine how people vote or whether they vote. Right. So this is good. I want to go back to NATO, though, and this amazing act of journalism you committed.
Let's return from our frenzied argument detour and to the meat of the reason for this Zoom chat.
Let's talk about journalism. Which is your bailiwick. I mean, I think primarily you're a critic of journalists these days, or journalism, aren't you? Primarily, is that your primary concern?
I don't. I mean, it's always been a concern.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, you do the best job.
I've always thought that it's worth keeping one eye on the behaviors of journalists, especially when they act in these sort of pack behaviors.
Yeah.
and so I'm almost feel like I'm on a safari mission. I'm observing them in the wild,
Totally.
and reporting back with my anthropological studies
Yep.
on how they relate to one another.
Yeah. So
Because
tell us.
it is interesting, and infrequently the journalists themselves also reported on as like just subjects,
Right.
in addition to whatever is supposed to be like the main subject of the
Right.
event that they're at, like a NATO summit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they don't really think of themselves, or they don't conceptualize themselves as open to the same kind of reportage as the officials who are walking around, or the decrees that are issued, that kind of thing. But I think it's almost like half the story, or maybe even more, because most people are not going to be paying a whole lot of attention to the NATO summit or even know what it is.
Right.
And the only reason it's going to impinge on their consciousness is because journalists decide to package it in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of the actual effect on the world of a summit like this, the media plays a decisive role and therefore ought to be scrutinized. And that's what I do just by instinct. I don't really kind of quantify it as, okay, this is what I'm going to be primarily interested in. It's just I walk around and go to places, and whatever interests me, I focus on.
Well, your reporting and analysis of American journalists, especially at this NATO summit, is essential for, if you want to understand American politics these days. Everyone should read your pieces on this very thing, because their behavior at this summit, as you describe it, means that we have no journalism in this country.
Yeah.
So can you describe like what you saw in the wild on your safari? How were the animals behaving?
Well, I mean, the most embarrassing episode by far that I witnessed was the Joe Biden press conference,
Yeah.
on a variety of levels. So Biden has done far fewer press conferences or media availabilities of any kind than his predecessors, including Trump, but also Obama, Bush. And so this NATO summit was one of the rare instances in which he was going to do a full-fledged press conference, in part because I think it would have seemed weird if he hadn't, because most of the other world leaders were doing it, and it was just kind of expected that he would follow suit. I'm sure his handlers would have probably preferred that he not. So, the compromise solution was that he would do a fake press conference, in that he would mosey up to the podium with a lit. This is how it works, because most I think members of the public would assume that a press conference is a thing at which journalists go into a room, they sit down, then an official appears before them at a lectern, and the journalists who are assembled can raise their hands and hope to be triumphantly called upon and ask a real hard-hitting question of that official. And then democracy is in action, and we have a vibrant free press that we can all thank the founding fathers for, right? It's not how it works at all anymore. Maybe this has never been how it works. I wasn't around when Nixon held his press conference after doing the opening with China or whatever, but it's not how it works now. Trump did do more free-flowing press conferences.
Sure did.
On occasion. He did some more structured ones, but it was a mix, right? Biden seemed to do exclusively or near exclusively these fake press conferences, and fake in the sense that the president comes out, he does some remarks, and then it doesn't matter who's raising their hand. Like, the act of raising your hand at these press conferences is superfluous, because he's not looking out on the crowd of journalists to see who to call on. His staff have provided him with a list of journalists that have been pre-selected to call upon. So it's almost redundant to even make it a press conference in the first place. They could have just made it some kind of other contrived question and answer session, but they give it the appearance of a press conference, because that seems like a open-ended and exciting, and a real exercise of our democratic values. But he just calls on a bunch of journalists that you're drawn on a list that have been handed to him that he takes with him to the podium. And by the way, Boris Johnson did the same thing. maybe if he had been a little bit more lax, meaning Boris Johnson in his question-taking systems, that he might not have been ousted the following week. I'm going to just take credit for that because it was only a couple days after I left his presence. But I was in hilariously, I was in a position where if it was an actual press conference with Joe Biden, then I could have very easily been called on. I was in a fairly advantageous seat, so I think I was maybe 2 or 3 rows back.
Wow.
Slightly to the right. Just me being there again was amusing.
Yeah.
But I was, right next to this woman, Kelly O'Donnell from NBC News, who was called upon, and not even called upon, but selected in this preordained way, and got to ask Biden a phony question. And the question that Kelly O'Donnell chose to ask Biden after NBC News paid her expenses to come to Madrid, Spain, hotel, transportation, airfare, all the rest. Sorry, I still have lingering effects of COVID, which I told you before we started. I hope I contracted at the NATO summit, because then I can accuse them of, killing grandmas all around the world.
That's right.
By not having any kind of COVID mitigation mechanisms in place, which they really didn't, interestingly enough, except on the shuttle bus to go back and forth between this pickup point and the summit itself. On the bus, you had to wear a mask because that's still the law in Spain for public transportation, but nowhere else. It wasn't even brought up. Wow. Anyway, so Kelly O'Donnell is one of these preordained journalists that Biden, has this pantomime of a press conference interaction with. And she stands up and just starts talking about Roe versus Wade. which boy. I get what was like five days or so before that had been overturned, which I'm not denying is a significant issue. Sure. But we're at an international summit where Biden is supposedly the head of this military alliance. Effectively, he is the head. I mean, the military commander of the NATO command structure is always a U.S. general. A new one was just appointed actually on the 4th of July. Always since the founding.
Always has been. Yep.
And that commander ultimately reports to Biden as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces.
That's right.
So, Biden runs this alliance.
That's right.
It's not like Montenegro is calling the shots, or North Macedonia.
Right.
And so all the U.S. journalists can think to do, and these are members of the White House press pool, so they're in this cloistered little group of journalists who are given the incredible privilege of following around Biden wherever he might travel, and they have these preset seating arrangements that are given to them to give them sort of preferential access to Biden. And Kelly O'Donnell asked a question that seems tailored just for, a quick little soundbite that they might show on the Today Show that morning, but has nothing at all to do with the summit, has nothing at all to do with any foreign policy issue that could be conceivably connected to the summit, where, let's remember, they ended up decreeing in that strategic document that NATO was now readying itself to wage nuclear war. But that I guess wasn't newsworthy enough for Kelly O'Donnell or even the AP, who also asked a question along these lines. And so they just have to get Biden to just riff on the Supreme Court and Roe versus Wade and abortion policy at this international. It's not like they're in Washington, D.C. at this asking this question. They're in Spain at an international summit, and on top of the totally vacuous questions that are asked of Biden by the U.S. journalists, Biden doesn't even give the pretense of even entertaining calling on a foreign journalist, of which there are many in the room. You would think that because Biden could send out, the troops of, I don't know, Hungary or something into war, they might call on a Romanian journalist, whoever. But no, it was a grand total of 5 journalists from the most, mainstream superficial outlets.
Mm-hmm.
And I shouldn't say totally superficial, because like the Wall Street Journal and the AP were called on, and occasionally the AP and the Wall Street Journal will put out like a decent article, right? But it's almost inherently superficial when their correspondents are in this environment where they've been pre-selected to ask Biden a question pursuant to their status as members of this White House press pool. Because if they were to ask a question that were too inflammatory or rock the boat a bit too much, then that could jeopardize their position within this White House press pool, and their editors don't want that. So for their own professional reasons, they have to ask a very kind of programmatic question that really only does nothing to advance public knowledge, except just get one of these trivial little sound bites that aren't related at all to the substance of what was being discussed at this international summit.
Wait a minute.
Is potentially bringing us to the precipice of World War III, and I will stop my rant there.
No. I mean, I feel you, brother, but listen, I think that question about abortion was actually very important. What was the answer given to the question? What was NATO's position on Roe v. Wade and abortion? What was said at the conference?
It wasn't about NATO's position. It was just about Biden's position. It was just a purely domestic U.S. political issue.
Oh, but no, but didn't NATO make a statement about abortion and Roe v. Wade at the summit, or at some point? They did. Or the EU did. Either the EU or NATO did.
It probably came up.
Well, what do you think?
You know, they have. Well, I think I know what you're getting at, because there are, one of the planks of NATO nowadays is like gender equity.
Boom.
And so there were events where, these female foreign ministers from Spain and Germany, I think it was, which I attended. And, it's funny because there was the German foreign minister who's a Green Party member of the governing coalition in Germany right now. She's the most hardcore proponent of Germany abandoning its foreign policy since World War II to send weapons into a war zone. And she's always trying to cajole Scholz, the chancellor, into being more proactive in sending tanks and missile systems and whatever else to Ukraine. And yet there she was at this official NATO event with her female colleague in Spain, and also this woman who works for NATO as like their gender correspondent or something. Talking about the importance of gender parity in defense policy.
Right. Okay.
I mean, the question I was going to ask them was just, okay, who cares?
Wait, I care. Listen, here's why. And you should care too.
I know. I care in the sense that I think you probably care.
I'm not sure.
In like a more,
I'm not sure you know where I'm going with this.
Okay.
So to me, all that, their stated positions on abortion and gender equity, that tells me that the Democratic Party runs the world, that the Democratic Party controls NATO. The Democratic Party and its governing ideology are the heads of the empire. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think they control Western Europe. I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think there are
NATO. They control NATO.
Yeah. I mean, generally, I think you're right. And I think in that sense, it is an important window into the ruling ideology.
Yeah. Well, I think she was asking that question.
But that doesn't excuse Kelly O'Donnell. I mean, in a more kind of practical way, it doesn't excuse the frivolity of Kelly O'Donnell and asking a question that's purely about abortion. No. At a big press conference at the summit. Yeah.
Fuck all these people, of course. Yeah. No, what I'm saying is Kelly O'Donnell, and asking that question, I think what she was doing was she was making Biden signal to the viewers of CNN and MSNBC that NATO is on the right side. NATO's good. They're good guys because they're pro-abortion.
No, I think it's much more simple and stupid than that. I think Kelly O'Donnell simply wanted a soundbite.
Okay.
That would be well received within a purely domestic news cycle context of Biden finally coming out and talking about, whether the Americans should trust the Supreme Court. Right. That was how she raised her question, like, should Americans have confidence in the Supreme Court any longer, given their decision overturning Roe versus Wade? And I really seriously doubt that Kelly O'Donnell has enough kind of layers in her thinking to say to herself, we want the American public to recognize that NATO has this agreeable ideology.
Well, whatever. I mean, whatever her intentions was, the function was served, right? People watching CNN and MSNBC found out that NATO's good guys. They're good guys who want they like Roe v. Wade and they like gender equity.
I mean, there was an attempt by Politico did an article, and this was a guy who's based in DC for Politico, came to the summit and did an article about how allegedly at a group of either foreign ministers or defense ministers one night, there was talk about how Roe versus Wade being overturned could undermine the moral stature of America as the leader of NATO.
Bingo.
And I guess that I'm sure that was discussed by some of these Western European countries,
Bingo.
probably, which has laws that are more restrictive than a lot of the laws that are going to be on the books now after this decision. But nevertheless, yeah, I mean,
right.
that was sort of in the ether,
right.
In a way, and you could make this tenuous connection to foreign policy, I guess.
NATO is liberal,
especially given the specter of nuclear war.
NATO is liberal. NATO is liberal.
Yeah, generally speaking.
Yeah,
well, I think NATO could become less liberal potentially, depending on who gets elected in different countries. Because I mean, the Jens Stoltenberg was the former prime minister of Norway. He was like a head of a social democratic party for a while. It's not a foregone conclusion that the next secretary general would. I mean, there could easily be a conservative European official who would be running NATO next.
Interesting.
I think it's not a foregone conclusion that the current coalition government in Spain is always going to be including Green Party officials. I mean, it's probably going to be more toward the center left than the center right, but there could be incremental changes, I would think, within the European sort of milieu. But I think overall, probably you're right.
Okay. Let's finish by talking about your favorite journalist, Natasha Bertrand. She asked a very important question. I mean, in that it was revealing of how American journalists, establishment journalists, think about these things. What did she ask of Stoltenberg?
Well, yeah, this was at a press conference with Jens Stoltenberg, which was similarly phony, in that the questions were already pre-selected, not the questions themselves, but the journalists that were going to be enabled to ask the question. They were pre-selected based on a list that a NATO press aide came on stage brandishing, and then called out on journalists to ask questions for. And I was sitting there waiting for this press conference to start, and I noticed that a press aide, a different press aide from NATO, was ushering Natasha Bertrand, now of CNN, to her seat. So ushering her to a seat right in the front row, best seat in the house, to ask a question. And I was reminded that, because I previously tried to get into what was called the Extraordinary NATO Summit, that they called shortly after the Ukraine war started in Brussels, so not their annual summit, which this Madrid summit was, but there was the Extraordinary Summit called in Brussels in Belgium in March. So I went to Brussels and tried to get in, and was ejected from the Belgian Ministry of Defense, which I've long said is not a thing that has any obvious reason to exist. But Natasha Bertrand was allowed in from CNN. So NATO has this glimmering, shiny new headquarters that they constructed for billions upon billions of dollars in Brussels. It was opened in 2017, but they told me they didn't have enough room to accommodate me, journalists. So I said, okay, so then why'd you build this whole new splendid campus that's supposed to house as many people as would be necessary? Anyway, but Natasha Bertrand was there. I noticed that she had two opportunities on consecutive days during that first summit to ask Stoltenberg questions. And her question on the first round was, this is a paraphrase of what she said to Stoltenberg. There's a provision within the NATO charter that doesn't allow for new NATO bases to be established in the Baltic states. So is there any discussion that's going to be had at this summit to do away with that provision so that new bases can be established in the Baltic states. That was her question. That was her bold adversarial question for the NATO Secretary General, trying to basically goad him into offering a commitment to establish new NATO forces ever more eastward.
Right.
Because, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, only joined NATO officially in 2004.
Right.
And then the next day, this is late March, the summit happens, and Stoltenberg is doing his end of event press conference, and who's there but trusty old Natasha Bertrand of CNN again. And by the way, Natasha Bertrand is one of the worst, absolute worst offenders of peddling Russiagate nonsense.
Right.
That's how she made her name in the industry. She started out, I think, like Business Insider or something, and she just got these leaks from can't say for sure who, but it sure sounded like Democratic staffers for the House Intelligence Committee under Adam Schiff.
Right.
That was sure the impression that was given by the nature of the reports that she was heroically coming up with that usually fell apart upon scrutiny, just like most of what was associated with Russiagate. But, it was great for her career, because now she has been given this exalted role at CNN to go around and be their big NATO correspondent. So at the first summit in Brussels on day 2, her follow-up question to Jens Stoltenberg was, is there any progress on getting rid of the provision in the NATO charter that would allow for the establishment of new bases in the Baltic states?
Right.
So that's what she and CNN institutionally apparently think is the type of accountability journalism that they're going to engage in with respect to NATO. It's not questioning or challenging anything at all, except the unwillingness of NATO to be as aggressive about expansion as Natasha Bertrand.
Right.
That's the kind of question she asks.
Right.
So then fast forward to Madrid, where I was there, and I watched her get ushered in by a NATO aide to a privileged seating position. And then lo and behold, she's called on first by Jens Stoltenberg, not second, not third, first. And she says, more or less, paraphrasing here, is there any thought of building new NATO bases in Finland and Sweden? It's the same question, but now she's applying it to Finland and Sweden because they were just granted NATO membership, or at least were granted the ability to pursue NATO membership officially at this summit. So that's the kind of question that's in her mind that would be conducive to ask of NATO officials. And that's the kind of journalist that tends to flock to events like this.
It's not a question. it's not a question.
Stupid. It's not that they're stupid. It's that they're so ensconced in a certain mindset that it genuinely would never occur to them to ask a question that you or I or somebody of a more critical disposition might think to ask that could challenge like a premise or probe an inconsistency. That's not what they're out to do. What they're out to do is basically to fortify and enhance the standing of NATO. And apparently, according to Natasha Bertrand, one way to do that is to, build more bases in Estonia and Sweden.
How do you understand that the American press corps covering this thing was more hawkish and expansionist than NATO itself?
Well, that always tends to be the case with journalists covering U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah,
I mean, I think the last time I was on here, we were talking a bit about Afghanistan, the Afghanistan withdrawal and the U.S. media coverage of that. And that was when they first really turned on Biden because they thought that he did this horrifically incompetent job in executing the withdrawal. And how dare you betray our allies? And what about the women in Afghanistan and all this? And then over the course of the Ukraine war, generally the question that gets put to Biden if he deigns to take one is, why aren't you being more proactive in sending X, Y, and Z missile system? Here's how they'll generally formulate a question. President Zelensky or his advisors say they need X. When are you going to provide X?
Right.
That's the basic outline of a question that they ask.
Yeah.
And they're the type of people who get the access. It's just the way it is. At the Brussels NATO summit, an ABC journalist asked Biden, was it unwise of you to so quickly rule out World War III? With the idea being that it hamstrung the US to really go all out in aiding Ukraine, including perhaps even, intervening militarily itself in Ukraine. These are just the types of questions that are always asked. I mean, I think it's because I think a lot of them are just not very bright.
Yeah.
It sounds like maybe a frivolous explanation, but the thought occurred to me because when I was in the press conference with Boris Johnson, which I also tried to ask a question at, just kind of observing the UK, the UK's equivalent of the White House press corps, or press pool. You got the sense that you have to, in the UK, kind of exhibit a trait of being what I would call clever, where you have to have some modicum of intelligence to get to the point where you're in a position of being able to ask the prime minister a direct question. Where I just don't think that the US media selects for that same trait. I think it selects for people who are just kind of nice performers.
Well, remember what the Iraq War did for CNN. Remember what the Spanish-American War did for the Hearst newspapers. I think it is very depressing, but I think this is true. I want your take on this. Is it not true that commercial journalism, I guess you would say, is inherently pro-war? Because pro-war is the most dramatic thing, and drama sells newspapers and increases ratings.
I don't know. Would you expect that NPR would ask a really incisive question in that context? I don't. I mean, I don't think. I doubt. I mean, I think there's maybe like a superstructural factor that may like attributable to the commercial incentives. But on an individual level, in terms of the kind of question that would be asked, I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's more of just this very myopic, insular mentality that journalists who get to that position in the U.S. where they can ask a question of the president, it's just something more. It's like something more atomized than them thinking that they have to ask a question that is going to juice the profits of their corporate ownership.
Right. Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I think you're probably right in a large sense, which is that they're just thoroughly acculturated, right? Into the ideas of the regime or the political establishment, right? So NATO, they walked, and I think you said in your piece that you felt like you were the only person in that room at the NATO summit who was skeptical of NATO's existence at all.
Yeah. Or not even skeptical of NATO's existence, but just skeptical in any real respect about the utility of NATO at all. Like even if you would concede to the legitimacy of its existence, which I wouldn't necessarily.
Right.
But let's say you do concede that. There aren't even people who would just like kind of be skeptical about just different aspects of NATO's decision. I mean, nothing beyond the most surface level take on NATO seemed to be exhibited as far as I could tell. And to the extent that there were adversarial questions asked, it was to try to, again, kind of bludgeon NATO or other officials into making even more aggressive commitments for the deployment of NATO force.
Right.
It's amazing.
It is. It's so sad and so scary because, as you said, these people basically are helping usher us into the next World War. Let me ask you one more question, then I will let you go. I mean, I want to get your just quick take on what you think is going to happen in November and what the consequences of that are. I mean, I see potentially a cataclysm in American politics. I don't know exactly what form it's going to take, but I see massive conflict coming soon when the Republicans take Congress and then take their seats in January and start investigating the workings of the Democratic Party, basically. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I mean, I'm sure there will be conflict in the sense of inter-branch conflict. if Republicans take control of Congress, and they'll try to investigate the president. I'm not sure how extreme it will be relative to other instances of there being split control of the different branches in the past. Clearly, I wouldn't be surprised if they try to do some, counter January 6th type investigation. I'm sure there'll be a handful of people calling for impeachment for this or that reason, as partially retribution for the double impeachment of Trump. But cataclysmic, I'm not sure. I mean, what do you think in particular is going to be so cataclysmic about it?
Well, I mean, they're gonna be in control of these oversight committees, with subpoena power, and they can pull people up in front of Congress, and force them to testify under the penalty of perjury. Fauci will be forced to testify and forced to tell the truth about what happened there. January 6th.
Fauci's testified 1,000 times.
But I think with full subpoena power, I think they can get more out of him and force him to say things, and not just him, but all the people involved in Eco Health Alliance.
I don't know. You sound a little too excited about what Republicans are going to do when they take government.
I'm excited. I'm excited and scared. I'm excited and scared both. Yeah, I don't know. There's other things they will do that I do not like at all. But no, I think, and January 6th, we're going to find out just how involved the FBI was in January 6th, et cetera. And then the election. I mean, whether they're right or wrong about the election, they're going to go with a fine-tooth comb through every election in every state. And they're going to investigate the whole thing. And that's just the fact of doing that. Just the attempt to do that will cause a massive upheaval, I believe.
I don't know. You think Kevin McCarthy is going to sign off on like an open-ended, all-consuming, state-by-state investigation into 2020 election fraud?
That's if McCarthy's still the leader. I don't think he will be.
Well, whoever the leader is.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. The leader is going to be different than McCarthy. The leader is going to be much more MAGA, which I think is an important category. I think that's tendency.
What has there been talk about Kevin McCarthy not being the Speaker of the House?
They hate him.
I haven't really seen that.
Oh, they hate him. Yeah. I mean,
who's that?
Again, we don't know how many MAGA people will take seats, but there will be a large number for sure. And I think Republicans in general are going to lean more toward the Trump side than the establishment side. And so I think McCarthy is possibly in big trouble. But regardless, I mean,
I don't know. My sense is that you're overstating the gravity of
maybe. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Well, okay. Anyway, thank you for this. Really good fighting with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
It was fun. I think it was actually quite useful for me too. It made me think through all this stuff, and hopefully for listeners too. Yeah, thanks, Michael.
I have a couple more Substacks that draw from the NATO summit that I haven't finished yet because I took a couple of days to recuperate from my the COVID that I got, hopefully from Jens Stoltenberg himself.
Exactly. You're a victim.
People could be on the lookout for that if they're interested.
Victim of Western imperialism there. You got COVID from them. Yeah. So go to Michael Tracey's Substack, everyone. It is the best journalism you're going to find. Michael, thank you. Keep doing what you're doing. I can't wait to see what you come up with next.
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right, man. Bye. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.